Welcome to the Most Notorious podcast. I'm Eric Rivenis and glad to be back with you. Before we get to today's interview, I just wanted to thank those Most Notorious podcast fans who are able to make it out for the St. Paul Gangster and True Crime Tour on September 30th. It was great fun meeting you in person and talking about some of the more interesting murders and kidnappings in our capital city's history. Yes, our former governor, Jesse Ventura, created some controversy years ago when he claimed that St. Paul's streets were designed by drunken Irishmen. We had a couple of tight corners and close scrapes on those streets, but we made it out in one piece. You know you're in a unique city when two of the city's founders were a pirate and a murderer, Pig's Eye Perrant and Edward Phelan, respectively. The plan is to do a Minneapolis tour in May and possibly a Chicago one later next summer, so stay tuned for those. Once details are firm, I'll announce them here or on my website, mostnotorious.com. So let's get down to business. My guest today is Jay Atkinson. He teaches journalism at Boston University and writes narrative nonfiction. His book Ice Time was a Publishers Weekly Notable Book of the Year in 2001. And Legends of Winter Hill was on the Boston Globe bestseller list in 2005. The book he's here to discuss today is called Massacre on the Merrimack, which was just released last week in paperback. One of my listeners, Jeff, emailed me recommending this book, and I'm glad he did. It's an excellent, excellent read. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. I've been looking forward to talking to you.
So how did you come to choose the events surrounding Hannah Duston as the subject for your book?
Well, I think long and hard about what I want to write about, and I have never taken a suggestion from anyone else or my agent even, which sometimes is frustrating to my agent. But it has to be something where I feel like I can live with the story for 3 years and not get tired of exploring the story. So writing a book with someone else or taking someone else's idea is never an option for me. So I grew up in the region where the Hannah Duston story occurred. So I'm a native of and currently residing in Methuen, Massachusetts, which is part of Essex County. And the adjoining community is Haverhill, Massachusetts. And that's where the events of March 1697 took place. So I have a geographical proximity. And also I'm familiar with the contour of the story because when we were growing up, we would go to Haverhill and there's this large, slightly bigger than life-size statue of a woman in colonial garb. It's all oxidized now, so it's green. And she's holding a hatchet in one hand and scalps in the other. And we grew up going by that every time we went to the ocean to go swimming or on a family trip. And I remember when I was about, 13 or 14, and I didn't know yet I was going to be a writer, but I was an avid reader. And we rode by, and I said I was in the back of the station wagon. I said to my dad, something along the lines of, "What's up with the lady with the hatchet?" And my father, being a succinct man, gave me the shortest history lesson in history. He looked back into the carload of kids, and he said, "That's Hannah Duston. She killed the Indians. Now shut up back there." And since then, the story has persisted in my memory, and I know that there's these apocryphal versions of the story, and there has never really been a major narrative nonfiction book done about it. And when I was casting around for an idea, I tend to do things that are completely different from the previous project just to keep myself interested. And this was new for me. I'd never done a historical narrative, historical nonfiction narrative, at least not going that far back where you can't talk to anyone that was around in that time. So I'd be spending a lot of time in the library. And Haverhill has a special collections room, and they have a lot of ephemera related to Duston. And then there's a couple of other local historical societies that have information. So after traveling pretty far for a couple of previous books, this book I could write and re-experience the landscape without going far from home. And that was an attraction too. I'm going to tell a local story, but I'm going to try to put Hannah Duston on a larger stage. I'm going to try to bring her back to public prominence like she was in the 2 centuries after her exploits.
So before we get into the specifics, I'd love it if you could talk a bit about the political and social climate of Haverhill, Massachusetts in 1697. What would it have been like to live there at that time?
Well, even though Boston is only 25 miles away and Salem, Mass, both of which were the population centers in the late 17th century, is only about 20 miles away, Haverhill was a very remote settlement. It contained about 300 souls. It was clustered mostly along the banks of the Merrimack River at a place that had previously been Native American fishing grounds. And so it was very attractive to the settlers that had settled Haverhill in 1640. Unfortunately, though, there was really no English settlements of any significant size northward from Haverhill for almost 60 years. Haverhill was the limit of the English-speaking world in the New World, which meant to the north, west, and east, it was exposed on all three sides to hostile forces, whether they be forces of nature, the French, who are trying to colonize the same land that the English are colonizing, or the mercenary Indians that the French would pay to harass the English frontier. So Haverhill was exposed, more so than Salem, more so than Newbury, where the settlers that came over from Newbury settled Haverhill because of the fishing grounds 60 years previously. But the other settlements in New England were mostly clustered around Boston, and then there was very small settlements in Maine that would have been like way stations that the Indians could have ambushed on their way down and then still made it to Haverhill without anybody knowing they were coming. The wealthier families lived along the river in fortified houses, and they, just like today, the well-to-do of the 17th century in Haverhill, the one percenters, sold the outlying land to protect them from enemy forces. So they would sell 20-acre strip of land to the Duston family because they could afford it if it was not near the town center. So not only was Haverhill exposed to the wilderness and to forces coming down from the north to attack them, the Dustons were the most exposed. They were in the northwestern corner of the plot of land, which then contained all of Haverhill. So they were between them and the French stronghold of Count Frontenac in Quebec was several hundred miles of wilderness, and the wilderness was the province of the Abenaki, not of the English settlers.
Could you talk a little more about the Abenaki? What was their history in the area?
Yeah, the Algonquin tribes were one of the oldest family of tribes or collection of Native Americans. They were mostly originally anyway, east of the Mississippi and spread from, say, North Carolina or Virginia all the way up into Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. They were known by different names. The Indians that lived in the vicinity of Haverhill before Haverhill was settled by white Europeans were the Penacook. The Penacook were a subset of the Algonquin tribes. The Abenaki were also like a larger collection of tribes collected under the name of the Abenaki, but they were also Algonquin. So all the Algonquin tribes had their own language, but they could understand enough of each other's language that they were in the same family of languages. The reason why I say this in my book actually when trying to explain why the Indians would hire themselves out as like soldiers for hire or mercenaries. And it's the only analogy or the only bit of discursive prose in my book that doesn't take place in the era. It's the only time where I break the fourth wall and I use a contemporary reference. And I use Michael Herr's book Dispatches about the Vietnam War. And he was talking about the Montagnards, who are the native inhabitants of the highlands in Vietnam, I think Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. And the Montagnards are known as nomadic tribes. And the reason why they're known as nomadic tribes, as Michael Herr states very acidly and plainly in his book, We flattened their villages and we napalmed off their crops, and then we admired the restlessness in their spirit. So they were not nomadic by nature. The incursion of the white soldiers made them nomadic. So the original Algonquin tribes, although they would occasionally have territorial disputes over hunting grounds, were pretty much lived in peace. There weren't too many internecine wars between them, although there would be occasionally wars between them. The big opponent to a lot of the Algonquin tribes in New England, especially the Abenaki and including the Penacook, would be the Fivefold League of the Iroquois, who are in what's now like Ontario. That was their enemy. So when the Mohawks were seen in the neighborhood, all the Algonquin tribes would try to band together because they were ferocious. The Indians that attacked Haverhill were, at the time, being paid a bounty for scalps by Count Frontenac, who was the French colonial governor of what was then French Canada. They were from the river tribes of Maine. As a collection of tribes, they would be Abenaki. Subset of the Abenaki, they would be Tarantines. And then under the auspices of Tarantines, they would have been named for the rivers where they resided. So there would be the Androscoggin, which is the Androscoggin River in Maine, the Sacos, which is the Saco River in Maine, and so on. They were second in ferocity and warcraft to the Iroquois. So these were seasoned fighters. They were doing this because their hunting grounds had pretty much been emptied out by the white invaders, and they needed ways to make a living. So they would hire themselves out as soldiers to terrorize the English frontier because really they had no choice. Just like the Montagnards had no choice in Vietnam but to be nomadic because we kept blowing up the places where they lived and they had to keep moving. So it's similar in that sense.
Your book opens with a gripping race between Thomas Duston and a group of Indians who are moving towards his home on March 15th, 1697. Can you tell us what happens?
Yes, I mean, the reason why we know what happened, at least we know the opening of this narrative, is because Hannah Duston survived the travails that we'll discuss in the next few minutes, and she made it back to Haverhill 2.5 weeks later. And even though they were a relatively lower middle-class family, even though her husband could read and write, they were not part of the intelligentsia. They were not leaders in the Puritan church. They were not ministers because the Puritans ran everything, and which meant the clerics ran everything. So the local minister was Nathaniel Ward, and he wrote a letter on behalf of the Dustons. Whether they prompted him to write it or whether he wrote it on his own accord is unknown. But he wrote a letter to Cotton Mather and Samuel Sewall, probably the two most famous people in the colony, both participants in the Salem witch trials several years earlier, and arranged for Duston, husband and wife, so Hannah, who was 39 at the time she was taken captive, and her husband was, I think, 44, and the local minister arranged for them to make a long day's journey into Boston to visit with Samuel Sewall, who writes about the meeting in his diary. And then another lengthy meeting with Cotton Mather, and Cotton Mather writes about a 2,200-word narrative account of what Hannah Duston told him. And that's like the primary source material that's first person coming right from the Dustons right after it happened. So on the morning of pre-dawn hour, in the pre-dawn hour of March 15th, 1697, a group of Tarantine warriors, probably no more than 20 or so, divided themselves into groups of 3 and 4. And because they'd done this many times before, they arrived under cover of darkness. They were very stealthy. They moved very quickly. Research that I did indicated that the warrior tribes of that region in that time could run 5 miles an hour in snowshoes all day. So they could run 12-minute miles in snow on snowshoes for several hours. So they would come down quickly. They would camp about 20 miles away, and then they would come down quickly overnight. They would break into different groups with torches, occasional rifle or musket, but mostly they would use blunt instruments, pikes, and hatchets and war clubs and what we call tomahawks, but it would be more like an axe. And they would, by a prearranged signal, probably a single gunshot, they would lay into 4 or 5 outlying farmhouses that are located, say, a half-mile apart simultaneously so the neighbors can't come to each other's aid. And they would do it more as a raid of terror than anything else. What ends up happening on the raid on March 15th, 1697 in Haverhill is that they come in and within 15 or 20 minutes, they burn down 4 houses and they kill 27 men, women, and children, and they take 13 captives. And they retreat immediately with the captives into the woods. They're just trying to get the white settlement in disarray. You know, it's not a suicide attack like in the modern world, but it's a bold attack aimed at a small number of people to spread fear in the community, which is a terrorist, parallel with today. What ends up happening in the Duston's favor is Thomas Duston was the right person in the right place at the right time to make this a historical moment and not just a footnote in history about a raid where a bunch of people were slaughtered, because he had worked variously as a militiaman in King Philip's War, so he knew Indian tactics. I found records that he was paid 2 shillings for 14 months service or something like that in King Philip's War several years earlier when he was in his early 20s. So he'd fought the Indians before and he knew what they were going to be fighting like, what it was going to be like. He also was part-time constable, so he had like law enforcement experience. He was a farmer and he was an orchard keeper. And it was the orchard keeping, a brick maker also. So it was the orchard keeping and the brick making that led him out of the house on horseback before the sun rose, and he was about a mile northwest of his farm, and he saw the torchlight coming through the trees. And because they were silent, he knew they weren't settlers coming back from somewhere or hunters coming back from sitting in a blind all night, because he would have heard them, and he would have heard them speaking in English. So he saw the light coming, knew it was Indians. He knew they were unfriendly because there were no longer any friendly Indians in the vicinity, having mostly been killed off by disease and driven away from the fishing grounds by the white settlers. So he had the advantage of the horse and knowledge of what the Indians were going to do. He knew there would be only 4 or 5 of them, and they would be on foot. So he had some time to race back to the house, get into the house. His wife had delivered their 10th child a week earlier, and she was still lying in bed because for the first time in all her pregnancies, she had taken some kind of sickness after delivering baby Martha. Thomas took one look at his wife. I would be quite certain that they would not exchange any words. They know the calculus of the frontier. You try to save as many of the children as you can. It's an unsentimental way of looking at things. But he left his wife, his week-old infant, and his neighbor who was helping take care of his wife in the house, knowing the Indians were going to arrive any minute. And then on horseback, he spirited the other 7 surviving children. 2 of his children had died early in life from illness. So he was able to shepherd the other 7 children uphill to the nearest fortified house, which was a mile away, and using his size on the horse and his rifle, keep the Indians at bay enough to get the children to safety. But from that moment on, husband and wife did not know what occurred to the other for the next 2 weeks. So from then on, they were both living in total darkness over what occurred with the other part of the family.
Right, and it's just a harrowing tale as he gets his children to safety in the absolute nick of time. So what happens to Hannah? Can you explain her journey once she's separated from her husband?
So they take 13 captives and then they retreat into the woods. But on the retreat, they take her baby, and her neighbor, Mary Neff, who was 51 at the time, I think it was, and Hannah was 39. And Martha was a week old. They take Martha, and they have other captives already collected from the other farmhouses. They meet at a central rallying point. So the Indians are very well organized. They know where they're going to come back to. They're all going to try to grab a few captives. So the warriors regroup. They're about a mile away from a mile away from the settlement, as probably would be where they would rally at some high ground to see if anyone was following them. On the way, though, Martha must have been crying. I mean, it's a baby's never been outside. It's a week old. The baby was making noise. One of the Indians grabbed the baby away from the Mary Neff, the neighbor, and smashed the baby's head against a tree and murdered the infant. So it ends up being that the only Duston that dies in the raid is the week-old baby. At that point, it's late. It's mid-March. That's still winter in this part of the world now. Back then, it would have been even more so because there would be no heat island effect. There's no paved roads. There's no melting of snow. I mean, the snow is going to last into April, and the wilderness is dense, tangled, Hawthorne-esque wilderness that stretches ahead of them. So at that point, it seems to me, not properly dressed, yanked out of her bed in the pre-dawn gloom, her baby murdered, Hannah Duston had to resolve not only to survive, but to escape, and not only to escape, but to exact revenge. And I think it was, in some ways, thinking about it even from the perspective of the 17th century, she had almost like a break with reality. One of the ways that Cotton Mather defends her actions, what's going to occur when she gets taken captive and she's taken 80 miles, probably as the crow flies away from Haverhill, he uses a biblical verse to justify what she did. But in essence, he said, the Puritans believed that the wilderness was the devil's province. So like in the Scarlet Letter, Hester goes out and she has her adulterous affair in the woods because that is like the devil's province. So Mather is saying because she felt protected by no law, and by that he means not the law of man, but the law of God. Because she felt protected by no law, she felt hindered by no law. So once they killed their infant, in her mind, all bets were off. Like there was no quarter asked and no quarter given. And what she does is remarkable. I mean, what she's able to do as a 39-year-old who just delivered her 10th child, who lives in hardship year-round, 6-day work weeks, and then 6 hours at the Puritan services on Sunday, she's able to march through the snow at a forced pace. They would kill anyone that couldn't keep up and take their scalp because you could get 25 livres, I think the currency was, for a scalp, and 50 livres for a live captive. So anyone that couldn't keep up the pace, they would kill and scalp. So she had to keep up the pace with these warriors that were been under 30 years of age, all males, moving at a fast pace. And then she survives the next 2 weeks, trekking north along waterways whenever possible because the Indians would use the frozen river as like a flat road to travel on. So whenever they could get in riverine areas with swamps, creeks, rivers, they would use that for transportation routes because they were faster, because they were flat. So in 2 weeks' time, they take her as far as what's now Boscawen, New Hampshire, which is 10 miles north of Concord, New Hampshire, and Concord is roughly 45 miles by car from Haverhill, 45 or 50 miles. But they would have been traversing in a zigzag pattern because once they figured out that the whites were not following them, there was no militia coming from Salem or Boston or Haverhill to follow them, they would stop and zigzag to hunt for food. They would hunt for food for the warriors. They would not give the captives anything. Captives would have to forage for themselves for ground nuts and things that existed under the snow. So it was 2 weeks of hell, and she survives it, and then they end up in Boscawen, New Hampshire, and that's where the story takes it's darker and more like remarkable to the point of fantastic aspects.
Besides Hannah and Mary, there is another captive that plays a pivotal role in this story. There's a boy that befriends them. Can you talk about how this relationship develops and how he's able to assist their survival on this march?
Yeah, shortly after they were taken captive, and she meets up at that rallying point, probably about a mile north of what's now the Haverhill, Massachusetts, and Plaistow, New Hampshire border. At the time, Plaistow, New Hampshire was part of Massachusetts. The lines were redrawn later in 1720. So she gets to this rallying point, and she sees a lot of her neighbors, including Hannah Bradley, who will end up being taken captive twice by the same group of Indians, at least the same tribe. She recognizes everyone except for a 14-year-old boy whose name turns out to be Sam Lennerson. She doesn't know who he is, and she probably doesn't even immediately recognize him as a white child, like as a child of the white settlements, because he had been taken captive from Worcester, Massachusetts, somewhere, depending on the account, from 6 months to a year earlier. So if we split the difference, like he'd been a captive of the Indians for about 9 months, so he probably would have been, his original clothing would have been in rags, and they would have given him like deer hide clothing, which was very durable and what the warriors would have worn. He would have been dirty and grimy from being outside most of that time. So he would have probably at first appeared to be a Native American boy, although that would have seemed odd to Hannah, because why would he be with these warriors if he's so young and he's not armed? Turns out he's a captive who's almost like a trustee in prison. He's a captive who has a master who is teaching him the Abenaki language, who is potentially grooming him to be adopted into the tribe. A lot of times the Native American tribes in that era, in that place, would adopt a captive to take the place of a warrior killed or a child that died if they felt the captive was young enough to forget about his home and old enough to survive on his own, where they wouldn't have to baby him. So Lennerson was able to move back and forth between his master, which was one of the warriors, his name was Vampiko, and Hannah. And Hannah immediately, she was a very smart and savvy woman. I think she genuinely liked Sam Lennerson, and they had a bond, but she also knew that she could use Sam Lennerson as an agent to go back and forth between the Indians to find out what they were planning on doing. And back to where the captives were, he was able to move back and forth. So he becomes a major actor in this and a major catalyst for what's going to occur. When they get about 10 days out, she tells Sam Lennerson, now they know each other quite well, like, find out from your master how they kill with that war club. And I remember reading a description from a book called New England Prospect, written by William Wood, published in London in 1640. He described a tomahawk, which we think of from like Western movies, as being a 2.5 to 3 foot piece, like branch from ash or elm. It would be like the same wood they used to make hockey sticks out of, very durable. And then at the end of it would be a football-sized rock tied to the end of that staff with deer song. So it's not a little hatchet. It's a sledgehammer made out of rock. So she is asking him, if you're going to use that to kill someone, where do you strike them so you can kill in one blow? He goes to his master. His master is pleased that he's interested in warcraft, and he explains to him, he points to his temple, and he says, this is the thinnest part of the skull, essentially, and if you hit your enemy right here once hard, they'll die in one blow. So he goes back to her, and he tells her that, and then she's biding her time until the Indians break up into smaller groups and take certain captives for themselves and their families and leave the others to make their own way north. And they do that on an island in the Merrimack River at the confluence of the Penacook and the Merrimack River, called Sugar Ball Island. And Sugar Ball Island had been the legendary summer home, summer residence of the great warrior of the Penacook, Passaconaway. So she's actually on this little triangular island surrounded by water on all sides, and she engineers not just her escape, but her revenge.
And the group dynamics have changed at this point, as you've just mentioned. They've split off into smaller groups. Hannah's not surrounded by warriors anymore. There are still 2 men, I believe, but
Yeah.
there are also a number of women and children. But as they're traveling, she knows that in the direction they're going, they will be encountering more and more Indians. So she knows she needs to act, or all will be lost soon for them.
The farther north they go, they're going to get away from the Merrimack River, and they're going to be closer and closer to Indian settlements and nowhere near any white settlements they know are far behind them now.
Can you talk about this infamous massacre? How did it begin? How did it end? What was the catalyst? She'd been biding her time until finally an opportune moment arrived, triggered by the appearance of a bottle of rum.
Yeah, I mean, certain things fell into place for her. And, just one thing, just to step back a minute, when I wrote the narrative sections of the book, what it was like to be held captive on the island, what it was like to escape the island in Indian canoe, the way that I was able to do that and the way that I was able to recreate the sensory experience of being dragged northward through the woods was because I do a lot of outdoor adventure writing, adventure travel for magazines and newspapers, and for my, for other books that I've done, taken some arduous trips. So I snowshoed, mountain biked, cross-country skied in sections, big parts of the route they would have taken. I figured out the route by figuring out where the rivers and streams were and where the original bridle paths were that the whites would have built over the Indian trails. And then I took the 2 winter canoe trips, one for the book and one to write a narrative that accompanies the book for the New York Times. So your listeners can look that up online and read my trip down the Merrimack by canoe. So once she got there and she was held captive by the warrior that killed her infant and Sam Lenerson's master, Van Pico, and then there were 5 women and 5 children, and they were on the island and they had canoes. She knew that she didn't know how long it would take, and she'd never traveled long distances down the Merrimack River, and she'd never probably been in a Native American canoe before, except to take her from the shore 250 yards across the open river, which would be high water and very cold and treacherous, which I discovered when I took those trips, and which they were a little bit dangerous, and I was able to recreate that. So she only had 250 yards of canoeing experience, and not as a paddler, as just a passenger. But she knew that the Merrimack River would take her back to Haverhill, and that the canoe would be the only way to travel, because if they traveled on foot, they couldn't follow their footprints. They would be covered with new snow, and she didn't know the way. She did know the river would take her back. So when the Indians were far north and they met up with their families again, so now there's women and children there, one of the ways the French would have compensated them, and one of the ways the French would have, appeased them, one of the things they would give them in addition to cash and beaver furs would be cognac or brandy. They would give them alcohol. And the Indians would feel like they're far enough away from, they would send youngest, strongest warriors back a few miles behind them every time they advanced, just to see if anyone was following them. And they knew for 2 weeks no one had followed them. And it's odd, but no one came after them. No one went in search of Hannah Duston or the other captors from Haverhill. Because of the terror aspects of the raid, they just hunkered down in Haverhill. They didn't go looking for them. So once they were on the island, they waited till the Indians went to sleep, and then by prearranged signal, Hannah, Mary Neff, and Sam Lenerson took up the Indians' weapons, which were the blunt instruments I described earlier, and they stood over, and the best and most logical surmise there is they would stand over the 2 warriors. So the 2 women who had grown up on farms and had hefted axes before and were strong would stand over the 2 warriors as they slept, probably in a drunken stupor. Not absolutely so, but I would say, looking at the way the Indians were paid, most likely that was why they were sleeping so soundly. And then they would have had Sam stand over the woman they thought was the strongest and the most threatening. And they were successful in killing those 3 with one blow. And they removed the most immediate threats right off the bat. The apocryphal stories that I referred to earlier in our conversation about Hannah Duston, the sanitized version, which you would hear spoken by Haverhill residents when I was growing up, and even when I got to maturity and I would hear about Hannah Duston. Well, she killed, 2 warriors and 5 women and 5 children while they slept, as if she gave them sleeping pills, as if it was some kind of easy death. And that never made sense to me. There's no way you could bludgeon someone to death with other people sleeping in close proximity and those people wouldn't wake up. So I have a friend who's a trauma surgeon. He's one of my rugby friends. and he's also a transplant surgeon, so he transplants organs. And he's out in Los Angeles, and he knew I was writing the book, so I put together an email describing the terrain. It's only about a half an acre. It's triangular. It's like a piece of pie sticking up out of a raging river, freezing cold all around. There's no leaves on the trees. There's nowhere to hide. It's a small little piece of land. The Native American shelter that they would have built that was temporary, that they could knock down and it would just look like a pile of branches, would have had the Indians sleeping kind of in close proximity to one another in front of the fire. So I described all that, and then he sent me back a long email, which is in the footnotes for the book. And in it, he described what would happen. He said, if you wanted to reproduce this, what happened and what it sounded like at home, you would do it like this. Get a cantaloupe, a half-inch piece of plywood, and then a wet face cloth. Scalp, skull, brain. Then get a ball peen hammer, rear back as far as you can. Hit it as hard as you can. You would hear a loud crack, which would be audible, which would be the skull breaking, which would be audible within, say, a 50 to 75-foot radius. There would be another relatively loud liquid sound when you strike the brain matter, and then there would be at least one and maybe more agonal gas as they made a loud exhale. So his surmise was anyone within 100 feet would have woken up, seen what was happening, and scattered, because they're not going to lay there and wait to be slaughtered after hearing that and seeing the results of that. So that's how she had to finish off, I think, 8 of the remaining 10, because one boy she meant to take as a counter captive, and she told him to stay where he was, and he was smart enough to get into the river and get away. And one Native American woman was wounded 14 times, so she was hit with knives and axes 14 times, but she was able to get away. And from her account comes the oral tradition of the Abenaki, particularly the Penacook, and their version of the story differs, except for the fact that there was one Native American woman who was wounded 14 times and got away. So in the interim, two of the Native Americans survived this slaughter, but Hannah Duston, Mary Neff, Sam Lennerson not only hunt down like these children as they're trying to scramble around this island where there's really quite small, the size of maybe 3 basketball courts, and there's nowhere to go because the river's so treacherous that if you fall in and you're not in a canoe, you're going to go hypothermic and drown within a few, dozen yards. So they have to track them down, ride them to the ground, bludgeon them to death. So it's bloody. It's a bloody, massacre. On the other hand, there was a bloody massacre 2 weeks earlier in Haverhill. 27 people, including an infant that belonged to Hannah Duston, were bludgeoned to death. So it's sort of Old Testament, eye for an eye, and then they sit and wait for the sun to come up. So they're sitting on this little island with these 10 bloody corpses all night, and then they decide to scuttle the extra canoes and take one canoe and go downstream. And this is where the story really took on its sort of like larger-than-life aspect.
Would there have been any discussion amongst the men of Haverhill about pursuing Hannah Duston and the others?
Also there would be limited resources in terms of fighting men, and those fighting men would have families, and they don't know if this is the first raid and the Indians are going to come back. So they would have to ask another community to come and re-garrison their stockade so they could go out after the Indians, but the Indians would have already attacked Wells, Maine, and a couple other places. So most people would say, like most other communities would say, unless the major downtown of Haverhill is on fire, you're on your own. We're going to protect our own settlements.
Right. But there had to have been hope. I mean, there was a precedent, right? These captives would have been dealt to the French, and there was a chance that they might eventually be reunited with their loved ones in a few weeks, right?
Yeah, a lot of times they would. It would sometimes take over a year, which is what happened to Hannah Bradley, who was Hannah Duston's contemporary and neighbor, and roughly the same age, and she was taken captive with Hannah Duston, but by the time they got to Sugar Ball Island, she was taken away by a different family. And Count Frontenac was a profiteer, so he would pay the Indians a pittance. he would sell the captive first to a French family in indenture. So he would collect money from the family for her services for a year while he negotiated with her husband to pay her out. So he would get paid twice. He would get so many livres, or the equivalent of English pounds, like in French money, each month from the family that she was working, doing hard farming labor for. And then he would get a settlement of money and gifts from the husband. So Hannah Bradley's husband walked all the way to French Canada, pulling a sled with some goods on it and bringing the family dog. And he brought a coveted bag of snuff that was donated by, I want to say, the governor at the time of Massachusetts, although it might have been Rhode Island, to give as tribute to Frontenac in addition to cash. So there was a good chance, maybe 50-50, that if your relative was hardy enough to make the trip, you could get them back, but it might take years. And then some people would be young, taken so young that they would be baptized Catholic and they would start learning French and they would never go back.
I mean, the story of Hannah Duston is, of course, tragic. Her baby murdered on their march north, but it pales in comparison to Hannah Bradley. She lost a number of children. Isn't that right?
Yeah, 2 different raids. She lost family members in both raids. And so they took her, and she was taken with Hannah Duston, and then they took her again in, I want to say, 1703. I haven't read that section of the book for a while, but they raided Haverhill again. They gave the Duston house a wide berth. They didn't go after the Hannah Duston again, but they liked Hannah Bradley as a captive. They knew she was going to make the trip and not create any problems, and they could sell her again. They took her then, and I think one of her children were killed in that raid. And then 3 years later, the last set of raids that petered out after King William's War ended in 1698, the last raid was around 1706, and they came to her house a third time, and she told her husband, like, I'm not going again. At this time, they had a fortified palisade around the house, and they had 2 militiamen for hire living with them. So they had 4 guns. They had the husband, Hannah Bradley, and the 2 militiamen. And the 3 warriors just leaped over the palisade, rushed the front door, and tried to axe it, take it down with axes. And one of the warriors stuck his head and shoulders in the door, and with a large bore rifle, Hannah Bradley probably blew his head off because she killed him. So that was a message to them: I'm not going back. Like, you've taken me captive twice, I'm not going back the third time. So with Hannah Duston, after the sun comes up, they get in the canoe. They start paddling. Now, we tried this. We tried this on March 30th, 2015, and March 30th, 2014. We got in a canoe. So it was a modern canoe. We had modern gear, wetsuits with dry suits, with PFDs, personal flotation device, helmet. My friend that I went with was an All-American wrestler at Ithaca, very experienced in the outdoors. He's paddling in the stern, I'm in the bow. We're going to try to do what Bradley and Neff, Lennerson, and Dustin did when they left the island. They wait all night. They get in the canoe. They get about 200 yards away from the island, starting to head downriver. And Hannah Duston says to the other 2 people, I want to go back. I want to go back to the island. So she's obviously the leader of this group because they comply. We tried doing it. It was too dangerous. Like, to turn against the current, it's rocky. It's only about like a level 2 rapids, but that's plenty hard enough for cold water. And we gave up. We started doing it, my friend said, with so much gear in this canoe, if I turn the canoe sideways to the river, we're going to swamp. If we swamp, we ruin the whole trip. They were able to make it back in this lightweight birch bark canoe they'd never paddled before. They get back to the island. She had taken a gun from one of the dead warriors and gives it to Mary Neff and says, keep the gun trained on the other bank while I go on the island. And they must think, well, maybe there was more weapons or food that was left on the island, something of value that she forgot. So Dustin goes on the island by herself now, where the corpses are, and she scalps every one of the corpses, and she wraps their scalps in the cloth that they stole from her loom that she probably had spent months during her pregnancy weaving this piece of cloth. They took it from her. Now she's taking it back. She's wrapping their scalps, and then she gets back in the canoe and says essentially, in the parlance of 1697, she's like, let's get out of here. She's one badass lady because not only did she survive the march, not only did she escape, not only did she kill her captors, but she dismembered them. I mean, she took their scalps as proof of what she had done. And that gets her the audience with Samuel Sewall. That gets a petition to the General Court of Massachusetts. She gets paid, even though the English governor at the time was not paying for scalps, not because the English governor was more moral than Count Frontenac and French. They just had no money. So they make a one-time exception and they give her 50 pounds sterling. And with that money, after she survives, comes back, visits Boston, they petition. Some months later, she gets that money and they buy another 200 acres of land in what's now Methuen, Mass. So essentially, Hannah Duston was my neighbor. She, with that scalp money, was able to buy land in what's probably now western Methuen, was then the outermost edge of the western side of Haverhill. So that's another reason why the story appealed to me the more I started researching the land deeds and Haverhill and Methuen. Methuen was part of Haverhill until 1726. So essentially, Hannah Duston and I grew up in the same town, which I found fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. So I wanted to ask you about this. I've covered a lot of historical true crime stories here, but this one is far more controversial than most. You tell the story in a very factual, straightforward way in your book. You're not making any political commentary or anything, but you must get a lot of feedback, a lot of reaction from people who feel strongly on both sides. Hannah Duston as a heroine who avenged her murdered baby, and Hannah Duston as the murderer of women and children. How do you address those issues when they arise at speaking engagements?
Well, usually I just wait for people to approach me, and I've done like maybe 50 like public appearances and throughout New England, libraries, schools, colleges, universities, historical societies, and inevitably, because when Hannah Duston died, she lived into her 80s. And she had over 60 grandchildren. And so, because she had so many children that did survive, and they had one more baby when she got back and survived. Lydia Duston was born in December 1697 or thereabouts, like she was born like after she came back. So every time I do one of these events, there's a Duston relative that comes up. There's actually the Duston Family Association, which meets annually in Haverhill, has 400 members. And I've been a guest of the Duston Association 3 out of the last 4 years, either during their annual meeting or during the Garrison House tours or something like that to talk about the book. So their perspective, the two poles, which are really interesting, their perspective is completely different from the perspective of Paul Pouliot, who is the Bashaba, or chieftain of the modern-day Penacook tribe of New Hampshire. So I was actually on New Hampshire Public Radio with the host, and Paul Pouliot called in to give the Abenaki version. And his version is they never killed the infant. This is passed down, oral tradition by the Abenaki. They never killed the infant. She killed and maimed one surviving member of the Penacook tribe, the woman who got away, and the boy, but the woman is the one that told her story to the other adults, that they were treated well on the trip as if it was like a guided, like outward bound type thing. They were treated well and fed, and nobody was harmed. There was no captives killed along the way. No one killed the baby. So their version of the story doesn't really hold up, because I think that part of the reason why Cotton Mather and Samuel Sewall wanted to meet with her was they wanted to interview her and see if it was true. And they would have had the evidence of the infant's body. They would have had the local minister would have buried Martha Duston, and then the local minister, whose letter doesn't survive, would have written to Cotton Mather, they killed her baby, and I was presided over the funeral. So I thought that looking at the perspective of the modern day Penacook was a little bit sanitized. On the other hand, I sympathize more and more over the last 4 years. I've spent first 3 years writing the project, and then a year and a half, talking about it since the book's come out. I sympathize more and more with, hey, the Penacook were in the Merrimack River Valley, and they sold what they thought was shared fishing rights to the Haverhill settlers in 1640. They were supposed to be able to save this traditional Native American fishing ground partly for their use and partly for the whites. And then when the white community grew to over 300 people, they told the Indians to get lost. So the Indians were here first. They had dominion over the land. They signed a contract. I've seen a facsimile of the contract. Sagahoo and Passacqua were the two surviving Pentucket, which would be the subset of the Penacook, and the Penacook would be the subset of the Algonquin tribes. They signed it with little bows and arrows and little animal figures. They drew little drawings on there to sign, and they took so much money in consideration. But, years later, Passacqua, Sagahoo are dead. Most of the Indians are gone, and they tell any Indians that are in the area, like, now the fishing grounds belong to us. So at one of these events, there was a lot of Duston family members there, and I was talking to a guy, and I was saying, the more I think about this story, the more we can all agree the Indians got, like, overall in the New World, they were, everything they had was taken from them by force. And they were here first, and it looked like they wanted to try to live together, especially once they realized they couldn't win a fight. They wanted to live together, but the whites didn't do that. They kept putting them into more and more remote, isolated, desolate places over the next 200 years. But I said to the, to this Duston relative, who's an educated guy, he's a retired museum curator, I told him, I said, the moral question that I'm struggling with more than when I first wrote the book now, 3 years later, is this event, does it make Hannah Duston like prototypical feminist avenger, or does it make her the harbinger of the Native American genocide, where you just strike at the root, kill the children and the women by any means necessary to stop the growth of this people that actually belong to the land more than you do? So the guy was like, he doesn't like that point of view. He's like, no, she did exactly what she should have done, because they killed her baby and they burned her farm to the ground. And I said, and the guy finished off his like abrupt and brusque like response to my like musing that I was musing over by the punch bowl. And he said, they were nothing but vicious slavers, and I have no sympathy for them, meaning the Native American tribes. And I said, so I just, being from Merrimack Valley in Massachusetts, I can't really like resist an argument, especially if I feel like I'm on the winning side. And I said, in Samuel Chase's History of Haverhill, which was published in History of Haverhill, Massachusetts, which was published in 1840, but included access to town records that no longer exist, that Chase was able to see. Among the 300 people that lived in Haverhill, Massachusetts at that time, there were 12 African slaves. So there's no evidence that the Dustons had money enough to afford a slave. But certainly the Saltonstalls and the other leading families, the Wards, the families whose names are on almost everything in Haverhill to this day, had slaves. So it's okay to enslave Africans, but it's not okay for Native Americans who are here first to take temporary captives, turn them over to the French, and let the French deal with the renegotiation. And the guy got so mad, he just walked away. He didn't have a response.
Yeah,
so,
a lot of emotion, right?
I think it's a gray area. Where the Native Americans feel like that's their land. This is what Paul Pouliot was saying in this interview we did on radio. They should take that statue down and they should repatriate like the land to the Penacook. It should be ours. It shouldn't be partially owned by Boston and Maine Railroad, because now a bridge goes over the island. It's no longer used part of the railroad, but the bridge is owned by B&M. The city and town of Boscawen owns part of it, and the state has made it a state historical site. So the last part of our conversation, when Paul Pouliot was insisting they take that statue down and call it like ancestral home of the Penacook and shouldn't have anything to do with Hannah Duston. She's just a murderer who was there for a day. The host of the show said, well, that's not going to happen. So lacking that, what do you think is a fair solution? And he said, at the very least, there should be an obelisk of our own design at the opposite end of the island telling our story because our story is accurate and hers is inaccurate. And then they asked me, what do you think? I said, absolutely. I think they should get their say. The Abenaki should have their version out on the island where her version is enshrined. So far that hasn't happened. There doesn't appear to be any interest in the state in doing that, but I think they should. And the other thing I offered after this conversation was over in an email to the president of the local historical society, who's pro Hannah Duston, anti like the Abenaki, who was on the phone also. She called in briefly when we were on the air together. And Paul Pouliot, I had their emails. I said, why don't to raise money for the either for the Abenaki if they're raising money for their school system, or if the historical society needs a new facility, I would be more than willing to moderate a panel discussion at the Boscawen Historical Society. And with the publicity that the book is getting, you could have some of the Abenaki on one side of the panel and some of the local historians on the other side of the panel, and we could get a good audience and we could hash this out. Paul Pouliot responded like, yeah, okay, I'd do that. And the other people never got back to me. They don't want to do it. Which is interesting. Like, I've gotten some, hate mail and some trolling on the internet about the book from people that either don't like that it favors the Indians or they don't like that it favors the white settlers. And to me, I play it down the middle.
I don't see that your book plays to one side or another. These were hard times. I mean, it's a story filled with people driven by desperation based on their own personal circumstances.
It's impossible for us to imagine that for 60 years, Haverhill, Massachusetts, westward, so from Haverhill, Massachusetts, across upstate New York and into Illinois and Indiana and across through Iowa, there was no one. It was the wilderness. There was no one except the Native Americans. And also, there's no medical care. There's no transportation. If your child steps on a rusty tool, they're going to die. If you get a blighted crop one spring, you get some kind of insect infestation in your crops, people are going to die of starvation because the neighbors probably have the same infestation or whatever food they have, they're going to save for their own families. I mean, life was, in the words of the philosopher, nasty, brutish, and short, and they lived by a different calculus. We can't look at it through 21st century political correctness and say what she did was literally overkill. I don't think we can understand really. The reason why I'm interested in the story is I can't resolve it. The reason why I wanted to write the book is because I don't fully understand it. I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. The more I think about it, I do tend to feel more sympathetic for the Native American tribes, not just the ones that were affected by Hannah Duston's actions, but the ones that were living in the region. They got lied to repeatedly and then eventually got driven north or extinguished. So, but on the other hand, if someone I'm a father, if someone harmed my child, I would take some kind of action against them. So it's hard to say.
And there were children on both sides who had no control over their fates. They didn't ask to be put into a family that was being brutally driven from their ancestral lands. And on the opposite side, born on a farm on the edge of a dangerous frontier.
Yeah, right. Other than a few wealthy families in Boston, everyone in the New World lived like that. Other than the established families like the Sewells and the Mathers and the Saltonstalls that lived in fortified houses either in the city where no Native Americans had, attacked in quite a long time. Boston, there had been no real war of Boston. And even in Salem, there were some safe places, but for the most part, children in all the Massachusetts towns, all the southern New Hampshire towns, which would grow up during the next century, and the Rhode Island towns, there were no safe place. there was the weather, the wilderness, and then there was the Indians to contend with. So it was definitely a treacherous world they lived in.
And you write in your book about Isaac Bradley and his friend Joe Whitaker, who are two kids who are working in a field when they're taken captive, right?
Yeah, they're taken captive, and they get them up as far as Lake Winnipesaukee, which is about an hour and a half by car today, up the interstate, a lot longer on foot back then. And they're held in relatively secure surrounding. They're held by a Native American family. They're not tethered at night. They're sleeping in the same shelter with the Native Americans, but they work them. They work them 12 hours a day. They feed them, but they work them hard, and they engineer an escape. And the one younger and fitter and more savvy kid actually separates off from the other kid for a while because the other kid can't keep up, and then he goes back for him. The kid was kind of hapless in the wilderness, and he was overweight, which would be kind of unusual for that time. And he actually gets back to his friend, and they end up making their way over to a settlement in Maine by accident. They don't even know where they're going. They just want to get away from the Indians. So, I mean, it wasn't unheard of that children would be taken captive. And the other thing that Hannah Duston could not have known is, what happened to her other 7 children. When they take Mary Rowlandson captive 20 years earlier from Lancaster, Massachusetts, I think it is, and I used Mary Rowlandson's first-person account is really the only contemporaneous account of a white female captive writing down what happened to her. Because white women generally were not allowed to publish books back then. It was a patriarchal society. But an influential minister, it was probably Increase Mather, wrote the foreword to Mary Rowlandson's account of being taken by the Indians. And one of the things she talks about is to limit your will to escape, like to dampen your enthusiasm for trying to get away. The Indians would lie to you and say not only had they killed your children, but they'd eaten them. So as far as Hannah Duston knew, by the time she got to the island, Sugar Ball Island, as a captive, she probably would have been told that they'd already killed her other children and her husband, that she was all alone. Therefore, she should stay quiet and get turned over to the French so she could eventually get back to the white settlements because she has no family left. Even if they didn't tell her anything about her children, which I doubt, because that was part of their tactic, she still wouldn't have known. She wouldn't have known that Thomas was successful in getting all 7 children. They couldn't put them all on the horse, so he was able to get all 7 of them to safety. She wouldn't have known that.
So where can people learn more about you and your work?
They can look at jatkinson.com, my website. I have a pretty good presence on social media, on Facebook and Twitter. I'm also listed, and my email address is listed on Boston University's website under the writing program. I would also note that in the subsequent 150 years after Hannah Duston survived and prevailed over her captors, she was the subject of articles or stories or included in books written by Cotton Mather, John Greenleaf Whittier, Henry David Thoreau, and Nathaniel Hawthorne. So for 200 years after those events, she was probably the most famous woman in America, and they taught her story in school. It's only towards the end of the 19th century, when ideas of American motherhood get gentrified, that she becomes an embarrassment, and they start talking about like Grandma Moses and Whistler's mother and people that are more genteel as the leading American, historical women in America. To me, she still is and should be a significant figure in American history, because for a woman in that time to take that on to herself and then to go meet in person with Cotton Mather and say, this is what I did and how I did it, is remarkable. It doesn't happen. No, it doesn't. There's no other accounts. There was no meeting between Mary Rowlandson that I know of and like leading clerics of the day where she explained what she did, and she just survived. She didn't kill her captors and escape. So Dustin's story is like once really important part of American history, and now at least there's one little point of light where you could read a little bit about her and think about it for yourself.
Yeah. There are so many interesting aspects to the story. And the statues built for her in the 19th century, I mean, that history was whitewashed. They only mentioned the men she killed and not the women and children. And this is relevant to today because we're having these same debates over statues of people who are considered heroes by some and villains by others.
I knew, it's funny you say that because I knew I had gone through the looking glass and to the other side. When I was at an event in Haverhill for the book, when the book first came out, I was speaking at the Haverhill Historical Society, and there was about 200 people there, and somebody stood up that was like a PR firm that was hired by Haverhill to improve their image to attract more people for tourism and business and stuff like that. And they were like attacking the book, immediately went on attack, and there were two of them in the audience. And like the audience almost like booed them into silence because one of the things they were saying was they had painted a new mural, because Haverhill was a really famous town in the history of shoemaking in the Industrial Revolution. It was like Shoe City. It was the biggest shoe manufacturer in the New World at one point. So they're focusing on that and these refurbished mills that are made into like museums, and you come and see how shoes were made. So they had painted a new mural of Hannah, of all the historical events in Haverhill, and begrudgingly, this is on the side of some like railroad bridge, so it's huge. Begrudgingly, they included Hannah, but her whole figure is like 1/50th of the entire mural, and they replaced the hatchet and scalps in her hand with a bouquet of flowers.
Oh.
And I just said, okay, because the people were trying to give a lecture, like counter lecture to, they weren't asking questions like it was a Q&A at a book event. So after she said that, I said, if you don't have a question, why don't you sit down and let someone ask a question? Because when someone starts talking about a mural of Hannah Duston and let's put a bouquet of flowers because we think it's embarrassing for Haverhill to admit that they have a murderess in their history. And at another event, a few months later, I was told that the current mayor of Haverhill is a Duston denier, that he will never attend any events where Duston is going to be celebrated because he doesn't think it's a good look for Haverhill. And I'm like, that's insane. I can't believe that.
It's amazing the power this story has 300 years later on this town.
Oh, when you hear people talk in northern Massachusetts and southern New Hampshire about it, you're definitely on one side or the other. And there's no, it's like the red and blue states. There's no like middle ground. That's why, it's interesting. I think as a, because in a way this is a work of narrative writing and it's a work of journalism. It's a work of historical research. If you're really ticking off people on both sides, then you're doing your job, because you want to make it so everybody that is extreme, has extreme view of the events you're describing, disagrees with you vehemently. So then hopefully if you're not in the center of the story, you're near it.
Yeah, exactly. That is the place to be for sure. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This is a fascinating subject.
You're very welcome, Eric, and thanks for of all the hundreds of, good books and readable books that are out there, to be selected to be on Most Notorious is just great, accomplishment for Hannah Duston. For her to be remembered by your audience is wonderful.
Oh, that's very nice. Thank you. My guest again has been Jay Atkinson, and his book Massacre on the Merrimack is now out in paperback. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenis. Thanks for listening, and have a safe tomorrow.